It's a real privilege to introduce this inaugural lecture tonight. My name's Anna Meredith and I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences. So tonight we are very lucky to have Professor Jason Spendelow give his inaugural lecture to us. Jason is Professor of Clinical Psychology and Professional Practice at the Harper and Kiel Veterinary School. And we believe this is a world first to have this role. We're very proud of this, and I think we are convinced it's a world first, aren't we, Jason, to have a clinical psychologist in a professorial role at a veterinary school. So Jason's worked in applied and academic practice for 20 years, applying psychological science to improving mental health, well-being and performance. Jason spent his early career in clinical practice before turning his attention to applying evidence-based psychological strategies in the workplace. And his role at the Harper and Kiel Veterinary School is a 0.4 FTE role. As I said, we're very lucky to have him in that role, and it involves leading the strategic performance and well-being theme in the vet school, and he works there with students, staff and industry to enhance psychological thinking and skills in students and practitioners. So I've already said welcome to those of you online. A very special welcome to Jason's wife Georgia and son Aidan, who I believe are watching. Jason's title tonight is Leveraging Psychologically Healthy Organisations Through Psychological Science. So over to you, Jason. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. I think you've taken care of the first slide for me as well, so yeah, definitely pay rise coming. I think in the interests of crowd control, if you can just hold questions to the end. I just think that's in everyone's interest, so thank you very much. As mentioned, I trained as a clinical psychologist 20 years ago now, so I'm becoming the old guy in the room. And I pivoted kind of unexpectedly really into workplace coaching or non-clinical work, which really eventually led me down the path to my appointment at the vet school, where I've been leading the performance and wellbeing strategic theme as mentioned. So, what is a psychologically healthy organisation, or a PHO? Well, essentially, a PHO focuses on staff wellbeing and organisational performance via long-term, mutually beneficial or win-win strategies. And we're just going to develop that kind of definition of explanation a little bit and hopefully introduce a bit of nuance. And we're going to do that by just scoping the territory a little bit of this topic. We're going to have a look at our model for a PHO. Think about some of the potential mechanisms and the outcomes of a PHO. Think about how we can kind of quantify a PHO, and finally look at a few examples of how we might kind of intervene or bring a PHO to life, if you like. So that's what we're going to cover. And the first issue is really to think about why we would look at performance and well-being. And there's a number of reasons for that. And just a few examples here that well-being is a driver of workplace performance. There's some fairly good evidence for this now. Performance measured in various ways. Increased effort, increased innovation, for example. And we know that there is a good, fairly robust association between the two. There's also some evidence that performance-related factors do also have an effect on well-being. For example, if conflict levels are high within an organisation, that can negatively impact on people's well-being within that entity. Also, there's at least one strategic reason to think about performance and well-being simultaneously. And staff well-being is important, obviously, in its own right, but in a pragmatic way that satisfied staff are of somewhat limited value unless an organisation performs well, because if the organisation doesn't perform well, it's not going to exist. People are going to be out of jobs, and that's going to lead to all sorts of secondary unpleasant consequences. So there's a number of reasons why we want to think about performance and well-being simultaneously. So there are several models out there for a PHO, but there also are lots of criticisms of these models. For example, some point to the lack of comprehensiveness of some models, right? So some PHO dimensions remain underrepresented in some existing models. Also, we've got some issues around overly context-specific models. So some models are designed for specific industries or contexts. They're not generalizable as much as we'd like them to be, perhaps. And there's some issues around relevance. So some models, a lot of models, don't really kind of capture recent trends, such as the rise of remote working and the impact that has on the psychological health of an organisation. So what we have been doing is to use theoretical integration, consolidation of existing models to develop our model for a PHO. And we think this is a good way to operate in the space because it combines some theoretical rigor with some practical utility across different contexts. And this is our model for a PHO. Essentially, we've got 4 domains, which I'll talk through: safety and support, teamwork and fairness, valued and effective work, and development and growth. We can think about these as the 4 elements that constitute a PHO. And the outer ring simply represents the fact that we can intervene to foster, consolidate, or develop a PHO at the individual level, at the interpersonal group level, also at the organisational level itself. Right, so digging a little bit deeper into those 4 domains, we've got safety and support. So this is essentially an environment that looks after staff in terms of their physical and psychological well-being through strategies such as stress management, sustainable workloads, protection from harassment, having adequate resources to do one's job, and so support for individual challenges, be that physical or mental health challenges, etc. And in practice, for example, this means that employees have reasonable deadlines, they feel safe from bullying, they can take needed breaks, and they know that their organisation provides reasonable resources and adjustments to support their health. And if we look at an example of this, we know that workplace stress is associated with significant individual and organisational harm. It's a well-established finding, repeated many times, and we lead then into the second element of a PHO under this model, which is teamwork and fairness, which is a workplace that's really characterised by positive and effective interpersonal behaviours and relationships, essentially. And so that's expressed through effective communication, mutual support, equitable treatment, trust and leadership, and the full utilisation, or if you like, exploitation of talents across the organisation. And in practice, that's going to mean, for example, that colleagues support and help each other actively. Information flows efficiently and clearly and in a timely manner. People from diverse backgrounds are treated equally and fairly, supported in similar ways. And as I alluded to, employees' abilities, strengths, contributions are used effectively. We try and squeeze the maximum benefit out of the diversity within a group of staff or within a working community. An example of this in practice is that conflict can be associated with reduced workplace motivation. So if you've got interpersonal difficulties, it leads to kind of conflict, that has a material knock-on effect for people's motivation and presumably other secondary effects, engagement, etc., in their actual work. So if we go on to the third element of a PHO, we call this valued and effective work. And this is where individual contributions align with where the organisation is tracking or trying to track strategically. And that's really achieved via clear purpose, appropriate and timely recognition for people's efforts, productive performance, and sustainable work-life balance. Okay. And we see, for example, valued and effective work expressed through employees understanding how their work matters, receiving recognition for good performance or going above and beyond what's expected, producing quality results, doing that efficiently, and so on. In an empirical example of this in action, we know that timely, appropriate recognition for people's efforts actually increases workplace engagement. So again, another material effect or benefit of trying to address one of the many factors or variables that have been tied to valued and effective work. Okay. So the fourth element is development and growth. Okay, and this is really a work context, a workplace, where people feel like they have the support and the resources and the structure, the mechanisms to progress along paths that are meaningful, important, and relevant to them. Okay, and this can be expressed in practice through employees seeing how they can progress. So there's clear kind of pathways. They receive feedback that's useful, it's timely. It's the ability to learn new skills to enhance people's work and have, as much as possible, the freedom to decide how they complete their tasks or operate within their roles within reason, obviously, according to organisational needs. But we see lots of this in action in organisations. For the most part, I think it's in kind of patchy fashion, right? And one advantage of a framework for a PHO is it tries to organise all this good stuff in a structure that can be measured and followed. So if we think about the value of a PHO, we've got several different lines of data. We've got scholarly information data, but we also have industry audits and work. For example, Deloitte, large piece of work by Deloitte a few years ago, suggesting that a well-designed PHO intervention can have a 5-fold return on investment. But the domains themselves, or the positive outcomes, come in multiple domains, On the personal level, I've alluded to some of those: improved well-being in the workplace, improved job satisfaction. There are positive outcomes of a well-designed and implemented PHO at the organisational level, so improved productivity, innovation, profitability. But also, there's some emerging evidence now of benefits at the community or societal level, right? So if you have a well-functioning organisation in terms of its psychological health, then we can see greater community impact or engagement from stakeholders, more buy-in, more involvement, which potentially can bring a number of additional knock-on benefits, such as a greater pool of resources and support to draw from as an organisation tries to pursue its goals. The other thing to say about the value of a PHO is that it is very strategic. If we take, for example, the World Economic Forum's Future of Job reports published just a couple of months ago, one of the many points they raise is that 2/3 of job seekers now prioritise the effectiveness of staff wellbeing programs and practices within an organisation. This is now a really big magnet for job seekers. They want to see and want to know that an organisation effectively deals with and manages staff wellbeing. One of many points raised in this report, but just wanted to give you a feel for some of the potential connections with a PHO. Also, if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, PHO aligns with many of those goals. For example, a decent work. Right, so there's a lot of potential value here in implementing a PHO if it's designed and implemented well. Okay, take a sip and a breath, Jason. And we'll move on to thinking about potential mechanisms. Why, or more importantly, how might a PHO deliver these impressive kind of looking outcomes? And I want to illustrate this by showing just a few examples of important elements or constructs that are associated with a PHO. One of them is psychological safety. Psychological safety is an often misunderstood kind of concept. A lot of people think it's about people feeling safe and comfortable in the workplace, but actually sometimes it's the opposite of that. And what psychological safety really is a climate where people feel like they can speak up without the fear of negative consequences. Okay, so here we can be kind of candid, authentic, without the fear of negative consequences, which is really important for a number of reasons, which we'll kind of point to over the next couple of slides. But if we look at the associated benefits of psychological safety, we've got increased team effectiveness, innovation, and reduced burnout. And when we think about, well, why or how, more importantly, would psychological safety contribute to these positive outcomes associated with PHO, is that we believe that psychological safety can foster learning behaviours. For example, it might normalise vulnerability. If we're a learning organisation, we've got to do things like normalise vulnerability. I don't have all the answers, particularly people in leadership positions, right? So that's one of the hypothesised mechanisms here. Also, psychological safety can potentially free up cognitive and emotional resources that might otherwise be deployed in people trying to protect themselves from negative occurrences, particularly interpersonally in the workplace. So rather than directing a lot of my energy towards self-preservation, self-protection from real or perceived threats, that energy is going into being very learning focused and making a genuine contribution to the learning environment of a workplace. Okay. So a second example, work-life balance is very important to a PHO, and it's a self-defined, self-determined state of well-being that enables an individual to effectively manage their various responsibilities at work and home. So what that means is that someone is able to feel like I can manage the demands in these two really important domains, and ideally they start to complement and enhance each other. And that's suggested there through role enrichment hypotheses or theories, in that work-life balance brings reciprocal positive effects in both your professional and your personal life, right? So they build on each other. And also there's the hypothesis here that work-life balance, good work-life balance, work-life fit, can result in reduced conflict between those work and family roles. So not in opposition, competing for as many resources. A third example, when we're thinking about what are the potential mechanisms at play with the PHO, is DEI, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Initiatives, which, as I'm sure you well know, is a framework that promotes a diverse, equitable, inclusive environment where all employees feel valued, respected, and have equal opportunities regardless of their background or identity. And you see the links back to what I've already said about what a PHO actually is. And so if we think about DEI as a PHO mechanism, it's very important in order to extract and really utilise the various talents and skills within that diverse workforce that you have. And the hypothesised mechanisms here are things like improved cognitive flexibility, so I can more easily take the perspective of others or other viewpoints, bias identification, etc. So just in those three example components of a PHO, there's a lot happening in terms of proposed or potential mechanisms. So I think that what that really means is that if we take this initial definition of a PHO, which is pretty bare bones, we can kind of extend it a bit to suggesting that a PHO, what it's really doing is providing a safe and healthy workplace environment that allows people to immerse themselves in enriching work using strategies that maximise learning for sustainable high performance. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. So if we break it down a little bit, a PHO, potentially what it's doing here, is providing a work environment where I don't have to worry about my physical safety, about being bullied or harassed. It's an environment where stresses are mitigated and actively managed as much as possible. So by health, we're talking about physical, psychological, but also interpersonal, right? So there's good interpersonal behaviours, good collegiality, collaboration, etc. So if you have that as your foundation, what that allows people is to turn their attention and really immerse themselves in the work, right? And that work is preferably enriching in the sense that it's work that provides a context for me to develop and grow in the ways that I want to, okay? And that in turn frees people to use various effective strategies, cognitive, behavioural and interpersonal, that maximise learning for sustainable high performance. So strategies, cognitive flexibility, for example, I can take different perspectives, take on different viewpoints, consider them before responding. Behavioural strategies, active listening skills, negotiation skills, interpersonal abilities, negotiation, conflict resolution, and so on. So if we're then deploying those strategies, that really allows us to focus on learning in the workplace for the purposes of sustainable high performance, right? So one way we can think about this is what we do at work is not making widgets. What we do at work is learn for the purposes of high performance. And if we have that context in place, safe and healthy workplace, it allows people really to immerse themselves and utilise their talents, their skills, and develop in order for everyone to be better off. So that's my take on what a PHO is, or more importantly, how it's kind of operating to provide those positive outcomes for which we have growing evidence accumulating. Okay. So where we've got to so far is that a PHO can boost performance and wellbeing in the workplace. There's likely a complex interplay of mechanisms behind those positive outcomes, but I've had a bit of a stab at trying to wrap those up in a hopefully defensible package. But we need a lot of development in this area from a scholarly perspective. Okay, there's lots of scope, which makes this area quite exciting, but also quite challenging to present an inaugural lecture on, particularly if you have an unsympathetic audience. But you're all still smiling to some extent, so we'll carry on. A fourth point I wanted to raise is that a PHO can be quantified, and this is something that's often not done. We have these models that are put out into the universe, and then people skip a step by saying, okay, let's do stuff. But really, what we want to do ideally is to quantify a model for a PHO, because that's going to lead to all sorts of research opportunities and hopefully more effective interventions or a number of opportunities for applied work in this area. Okay. And we are now doing that with our model with the Organisational Health Questionnaire, which we've now run with a number of organisations, including the vet school. And what we can say is that it is possible to measure the psychological health of an organisation in a systematic way with an underlying framework, conceptual framework. And in our organisational questionnaire, we quantify the 4 components of a PHO that are presented earlier, plus a number of other key outcomes. And we would argue that this is a step up from a lot of staff engagement surveys that are out there, which often have no conceptual theoretical kind of basis. They're often tweaked and kind of changed. There's often a cross-sectional focus, so it's a snapshot to some extent, and there is often limited actionability to some extent. Right? There's a lot of variation within this, but the key message here is that I think we can really up our game in terms of staff engagement surveys and think about a more robust method of looking at the psychological health of an organisation. Yeah, and as I said, that we've deployed this questionnaire within a number of organisations already through kind of our early testing. And to give you a bit of a flavour, here's just a few snapshots of the report that gets generated from this organisational health questionnaire with a very handy colour coding system where we, for example, take the 4 components of a PHO and look at the quantitative data, assign a ranking, colour-coded ranking system, gold, green, orange, red, for easy digestibility by kind of lay audiences. profile key strengths and weaknesses, relatively speaking, within those domains. And we look at overall summaries for the organisation, look at the staff feedback in terms of what's working, what's not working, and what changes I'd like to see, and we wrap that up in a package. This is a summary screen that you see from the report itself, but also we drill down into a lot of detail. For example, the domain of safety of support, we examine with a number of statements that respondents/employees evaluate on a Likert scale format, and we can start to rank and see more detailed information about what are the particular strengths and weaknesses of an organisation, relatively speaking, in terms of its psychological health in each of the domains. And we've also got a number of composite measures, right? So the four elements of a PHO are composite measures, obviously, but we've also got other composite measures that reflect important constructs or concepts within a PHO, such as overall employee well-being through to organisational productivity, psychological safety, and so on. ESG reporting is becoming a lot more important, so environment, social, societal, and governance reporting. I've really kind of driven initially from the kind of private sector around reporting to shareholders, around responsible business practices, and we've got metrics within the organisational health questionnaire that really examine some key ESG metrics, such as the extent to which an organisation is actively identifying, assessing and reporting on staff well-being, for example. So, we can conceptualise a psychologically healthy organisation, we can measure it. We also have strategies that we can deploy to try and improve the psychological health of an organisation or address the issues that emerge through the measurement of a PHO. So, we've got cognitive, behavioural and personal strategies, as I mentioned, at our disposal. And the nice thing about these strategies is that we can address both issues or difficulties or relative weaknesses, or what we call kind of pain points within an organisation, but also relative strengths, what we call kind of magnet points. So these data that come from the report can be simultaneously used, say, let's address where you need to pick up your game, as well as build on strengths that you already have. Cool. And I'll just give you a few examples to give you a bit of a feel for that. So, one really common pain point for most organisations is staff retention, okay? And it is associated with really significant business costs, but there are multiple reasons why people resign. It's a complicated picture. But through PHO intervention mechanisms, we, in theory at least, can address a number of these factors. So, for example, burnout is a major reason why people leave, but we now have some good holistic interventions for burnout in the workplace that we can deploy. There's a group in Australia and Sydney, for example, who've led a lot of work on this in recent years. Another reason why people resign is dissatisfaction with their role. And we can use strategies such as job crafting to really try and involve people actively in their roles, exploit their talents, and hopefully minimise the risk for that dissatisfaction. People also resign for various interpersonal challenges or issues, and we can look at communication, for example, in various forms. But we can look at more kind of novel interventions, such as helping people to network authentically or effectively when they don't have the confidence to do that, or they kind of cringe at the thought of going to a collegial kind of meeting where there's informal mingling involved. Yeah, so a second really common pain point is staff stress. I've alluded to this already. It's an increasing problem, this isn't a decreasing problem, and there's really substantial annual per employee costs involved and accruing. But through a PHO framework, we can look to address the staff stress. For example, we can provide individual support for the types of factors that increase stress at that individual level. So, for example, I've worked with a number of very successful people who have an inability or reluctance to delegate to their team. Fear of negative evaluation by colleagues is really common. Procrastination is really common. These are individual factors that can increase staff stress that we've got good interventions for, thanks to applied psychological science. But also at that group and organisational level, we need to look at to actively identify and mitigate workplace stresses. And if you have good data on these stresses, there's a lot you can do. And an example of this is a study that we conducted recently, the Vet Stressor Study, where we sampled a large number of vet surgeons and vet nurses to kind of profile the top stresses in this industry. And those are the top 5 stresses. Everything from dealing with staff shortages, which obviously is a structural kind of issue with the profession, through to high performance expectations from self. And we can do group level analyses of these data to kind of reveal that, for example, the top 5 stresses are going to differ depending on your experience level or your career stage. So if we can obtain these data from the workplace, we can be much more effective in how we target our stressor mitigation program, right? So the data is very important, but a really useful and powerful technique to manage the stress in the workplace. Okay, on the other side of the coin here, rather than looking at pain points, we can look at magnet points. How can we be more attractive to people, but also how can we make the environment more psychologically healthy for the people we already have? One thing we can do, which is very PHO consistent, is make this paradigm shift that I mentioned earlier, that work isn't making widgets or producing manuscripts. Work is about learning for the purposes of high performance. And when we do that, it opens the possibility for much more effective mindsets from a performance and well-being perspective. For example, we can see errors and failures as learning opportunities rather than things to run from. And we've got Amy Edmondson's done some really useful work in this area. She is really attached with the psychological safety concept, but more recently has done some work around a structured framework to approach failure intelligently, as she calls it. But also we can use other tools such as structured reflective practice. For example, we've been doing this with our year 1 vet surgeon students and with qualified vets and vet nurses out in practice, using a variation on the Kolb adult learning kind of model to provide a very applied structural reflective practice model that we can implement in any workplace experience, good or bad, where the people involved feel like there's something significant about it. There's some learning to be had. And finally, just a second magnet point here. Fostering a high participation culture is a real attraction point now for candidates and people within organisations. So here we're looking at a high participation culture characterised by inclusivity, shared mission, and exploiting talent that's there. So themes that I've already picked up upon in this talk today. So the benefits of a PHO intervention in this area can be enhanced through employee involvement and program development. So if we're looking at implementing a PHO model or intervention in an organisation, it's really important to get employees involved in the design of that. So that is PHO consistent and consistent with this high participation culture. And again, we can do that through various mechanisms, practical strategies, such as the promotion of psychological safety. There's now programs of training around promoting psychological safety within organisations. And again, as I mentioned before, leaders modelling fallibility. I don't have all the answers. I need you. I need your input, and actively soliciting that input from people. So there's some examples of how we actually can implement a PHO in practice. There are an endless range of possibilities and a large number of strategies available to us from psychological science. So we do have already a really good toolkit of interventions that have some empirical support behind them. So we've got a long way to go in terms of the development of this area, but we still have a lot of material that we can use to our advantage in the here and now. So drawing those strands together, we could say, I believe, that a psychologically healthy organisation can boost both performance and well-being in an organisation. And for reasons that I alluded to earlier, it's important to think about both performance and well-being simultaneously. There's likely to be a fairly complex interplay of mechanisms behind these positive outcomes, and there's a lot of opportunities for more robust research methodologies to investigate this in more detail and give us some better quality data to run with, as I mentioned there. But we already have many tools at our disposal to boost the psychological health of an organisation, and we are doing active work in that area, as I've talked about today with you. So that is a brief whirlwind tour of psychologically healthy organisations, and I encourage you to come and connect with me and discuss this more, because I'd be very happy to share my thoughts and my resources with you if there's something you'd like to get involved with yourself. So, thank you very much.